Have you ever looked at the daily news and just felt like you're only seeing the very surface of a much, much deeper game? Well, today we are unpacking an intensely complex, fascinating geopolitical analysis derived from our source material. We're going to explore claims that the entire world is undergoing a massive, completely hidden restructuring. If you're into the intersection of high finance, covert operations, and macroeconomics theory, this explainer is going to give you a whole lot to think about. Let's get into it. The sources actually kick things off by looking at the recent G7 summit, but not in the way you might expect. They highlight comments by former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump to argue that the traditional global power dynamic isn't just shifting, it's fundamentally rupturing. I mean, the diplomatic politeness we usually expect at these summits, it's seemingly evaporating. The speakers point out that Carney essentially dismissed the entire G7 as irrelevant, literally calling it the G whatever, and Trump's reported comment that "I'm the boss" at a summit meeting. The sources interpret that not as a passing joke, but as a literal declaration that the old rules just don't apply anymore. When the very architects of the system start calling it the G whatever, you know the foundations are shaking. Which brings us to the big, core question of this explainer. According to the analysis, are we witnessing the definitive end of the post-war rules-based order? The source material posits that for decades, global institutions have managed this very specific architecture of international integration. And this is an abstract theory, right? This is the overarching system that dictates global trade routes, the price of your groceries, and international peace. But the theory here is that without the United States acting as the primary enforcer of that specific framework, the whole structure is allegedly teetering on the edge of total collapse. To wrap our heads around this, we'll map out the source's claims across 6 key areas: the decline of the post-war order, competing economic systems, UK domestic and foreign tensions, the vast shadow banking network, the removal of Middle East proxies, and finally, what the new geopolitical paradigm might actually look like. Let's dive right into Section 1, the post-war order declines. The overarching theory here is that institutions built to manage free trade and globalist agendas are losing power, specifically because the United States is no longer acting as the enforcer. When we talk about the rules-based order, think of it like the global referee system the U.S. set up after World War II. The source actually references a British House of Lords report stating that a system like this literally requires a physical enforcer to have any teeth whatsoever. With the U.S. stepping back from being that ultimate referee under its current administration, organizations like the G7 are described as scrambling for relevance. The speakers even note this profound breakdown where temporary coalitions of the willing are increasingly replacing permanent, formal treaty structures like NATO. So if the old system is breaking, what's taking its place? That brings us to Section 2, competing global economic systems. The source argues we are essentially watching a global cage fight between two deeply historical ideologies. They contrast what they call the British system against the American system. Let's break that down. According to the transcript, the British system relies on financialization. It's all about making money by moving paper around, extracting wealth through offshore money streams, creating endless debt loops, and intentionally keeping developing nations economically backward so you can maintain control. In stark contrast, the American system, which is rooted in Alexander Hamilton's economic theories, is all about building physical reality. We're talking infrastructure, factories, tariffs, and the belief that internal, physical economic growth mutually benefits sovereign nations. The speakers argue the U.S. is currently weaponizing this Hamiltonian physical production model to actively dismantle that older debt-based financial model. Now let's see how this theoretical clash plays out locally in Section 3, UK domestic and foreign tensions. The speakers piece together a pretty explosive timeline regarding the UK. The source points to horrific, highly organized crimes, specifically grooming rings in the UK. But the analysis alleges these rings were more than just local tragedies. They were sophisticated organized crime syndicates engaged in massive VAT fraud, basically exploiting the tax system to launder billions. The speakers claim that figures like Prime Minister Keir Starmer, back when he was head of public prosecutions, helped cover this up. Facing intense domestic pressure as these massive scandals resurface, the theory is that the UK establishment is intentionally engaging in high-risk foreign provocations. Things like suddenly pledging 150,000 drones to Ukraine or having SAS commandos board a Russian ship. The transcript suggests they are desperately trying to trigger a unifying external conflict to save a failing internal political establishment. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the source ties Elon Musk into this exact theory. They note that Musk has practically launched a one-man media campaign against the UK government, posting polls about liberating Britain and deliberately amplifying the exact covered-up scandals we just talked about. The transcript theorizes that Musk isn't just some private citizen randomly firing off tweets. Instead, they suggest his actions align perfectly with a broader U.S. strategic operation to publicly weaken the institutional power of that so-called British system, right at its mothership. But why target the UK's financial system so heavily? Let's hit Section 4, the shadow banking network. The source cites an absolutely astonishing claim. There are 400,000 shadow banks operating on the tiny Caribbean island of St. Bart's alone. Let that sink in for a second. St. Bart's is famous for super yachts, right? But according to a former general cited in the transcript, it is also packing hundreds of thousands of invisible financial entities. A shadow bank is an entity that acts like a bank but operates completely outside of normal banking regulations. And that's just one tiny island. The speakers ask us to imagine how many of these invisible entities must exist in places like the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, or Hong Kong. The crucial point the analysis makes here is that this vast spider's web of offshore banking and former colonies is the actual engine for global chaos. The speakers point straight to assessments from the British National Crime Agency, which acknowledges that hundreds of billions of dollars are laundered through the system every single year. The speakers argue that the City of London sits at the absolute center of this web, using overseas territories as total secrecy jurisdictions. They claim this isn't just white-collar tax evasion. This is the financial lifeblood that actively funds global terrorism, cartels, and massive organized crime. Which actually explains a lot of the recent conflict we've seen, bringing us to Section 5, removing Middle East proxies. Understanding this offshore financial web is key to the source's interpretation of geopolitics. A proxy is essentially a middleman, a group hired to cause chaos so the real power players' hands stay totally clean. According to the transcript, the new U.S. strategy completely avoids direct military regime change. Instead, it focuses on systematically taking these funded proxies off the board. In this framework, Middle Eastern militants, South American cartels, and European organized crime gangs are all completely connected tools of that old imperial financial system. Cartels generate the illicit cash, gangs launder it, and militants cause the geopolitical chaos that prevents sovereign nations from making independent agreements. So how are they dismantling it? Well, the analysis suggests it's happening right now, but instead of sending in battalions of tanks, the U.S. is fighting this war with accountants and data. The sources highlight how the U.S. Treasury is engaged in a massive operation to literally trace dirty money flows. When illicit cash moves, cell phones light up in Switzerland or the Caymans. The strategy relies on highly targeted sanctions against specific offshore bank branches, aggressively choking off the money. Then, they couple that financial chokehold with physical maneuvers, like pushing Syria to cut off supply routes for militants. It's methodical, one-two punch to cut the legs out from under the proxies. So where is all of this heading? Let's look at Section 6, a new geopolitical paradigm. According to the analysis, this strategy of defunding proxies and forcing a return to sovereign nation-to-nation negotiations is what's actually driving today's global political chaos. Suddenly, seemingly disconnected headlines start to form a very clear pattern. The speakers point to the removal of figures like Maduro in Venezuela, not for standard political reasons, but to finally expose vast cartel money laundering operations. They question bizarre pardons in Honduras, and they heavily scrutinize Argentina's Javier Milei for sending 40 tons of gold to London. In the Middle East, they note a distinct shift away from funding traditional opposition proxies in Iran. The sources suggest that while these moves look chaotic and contradictory on the surface, they all map back to one sweeping strategy: completely clearing the global chessboard of the old proxy networks. Ultimately, this explainer leaves us with a pretty profound puzzle. We've looked at the sources theory of a dying financial empire reliance on debt and offshore secrecy. We've explored the rise of a competing Hamiltonian economic model focused on physical reality, and we've traced the quiet, data-driven war against a massive shadow banking network. If the shadows are truly being cleared, the offshore accounts drained, and the grand chessboard wiped clean, the real question isn't just who wins this hidden game. The real question is, whose rules are we all going to be forced to live by tomorrow? Something to think about next time you check the headlines.